Now, I transform myself here. Jonathan, in your always very kind introduction, mentioned, by the way, that I have spoken with presidents, vice presidents, senators, prime ministers, and so on. A friend of mine in Israel here who, like myself, owns a small orchard, asked me one time as we were walking through his orchard, "Brian, do you talk to your trees?" And I said, "Of course I do." And he said, "What's the difference between talking to your trees and talking to politicians?" And I said, "The trees listen." A closing speech really presents unique challenges. You can't really write it all in advance. It should somehow reflect the zeitgeist, if you will, the spirit of the conference, and really of still unassembled conclusions. You know, I should say this summit being held in the midst of Israel's longest war, a war that is being fought on multiple fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran. That the fact that this conference itself that the ICT and Reichman University were able, despite the war, despite the disruptions, despite the difficulties of organization and logistics, to say nothing of the psychological trauma of society in the war, and to carry this conference out so smoothly represents a major feat, a major accomplishment. And I really want to begin my closing remarks by remarking, how great that was an achievement, and to really compliment and congratulate all of those who were involved in this. I think this really has been an enormous accomplishment, and let me actually, on behalf of all of us, give you guys a hand. Jonathan mentioned that I have attended and spoken at a number of these conferences, these summits, and I always find them, the program, as this one was, are densely packed, and they're intense. And in this particular case, given the circumstances, also really heartrending. And I have to admit that I am, at the moment, a bit physically, mentally, certainly emotionally taxed by the experience here. And it's going to take me days, really weeks, to first watch the videos of the sessions that I missed, and to really fully absorb and reflect upon the information that has been passed on here. These sessions were informative, they were thought-provoking, they were alarming at the same time, and yet, as we've seen even in this last panel, they were in a curious way reassuring and strengthening, and so that is my really big impression. My comments today are really going to reflect only a preliminary sketch. As I said, I haven't fully put together my thoughts. One thing that I take away is that although it certainly is a cliche to use the word paradigm shift or pivot point, everyone always says, well, this is a pivot point, this is an inflection point, a paradigm shift. I truly believe that we are at such a moment. I mean, this panel, among the others, really have emphasized that things have changed and are changing in a fundamental fashion that is really going to require a complete rethink of how we do things. I mean, to give a few examples, when I began studying terrorism, researching terrorism in the 1970s, we were talking mostly about small clandestine groups. Some of them were capable of international operations. But looking back through the lens of a 9/11 or an October 7, I mean, in a sense, that seems to be, by comparison, a simpler and in many respects an easier time to deal with. And yet today, look, we're dealing not just with terrorist groups, we're dealing with terrorism proto-states, territorial entities that can field large paramilitary forces that have arsenals of rockets, drones, missiles, and, as we've heard just this afternoon, possibly assisted by AI. We see there were alliances among terrorist groups in the 1970s, but they were little alliances. Yes, the Japanese Red Army teamed up with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in a couple of episodes. But we see today a much more elaborate array of constellations. I mean, for example, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. This is far more advanced than anything we saw before. We see the current conflict taking place not just in terrorist operations, but involving land, air, maritime environments, and the virtual world, all at the same time. We see as a consequence of unprecedented terrorist attacks, armed conflicts, whether we talk about the global war on terror in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, or the wars that have the conflict that has resulted from the October 7th attack, armed conflicts that involve tens of thousands of casualties, including civilians that Hamas has deliberately exposed because the deaths of those civilians serves the narrative of Hamas that it's projecting abroad. The tunnels Hamas built were not for civil defense. That had nothing to do with it. The population is exposed to the conflict. We see terrorist campaigns, guerrilla war, conventional operations, military operations. In the past, these were separable corridors of activity, separate modes of warfare. That is clearly no longer the case. These have been blended. We saw state sponsorship of terrorism. That's not new, but today states have increasingly adopted terrorist tactics and the principle underlying terrorist tactics. For example, we see a surge in wrongful detentions, hostage-taking, open hostage-taking by states as a means of coercive diplomacy. We see states openly involved in murder-for-hire assassinations. We're seeing physical sabotage. We're seeing cyber warfare, cyber sabotage. And so that is much greater. The causes driving today's terrorism are not that different from the drivers of terrorism in the 1970s. Extreme political ideologies, far left, far right, racial or ethnic hatred, second big category, religious fanaticism, ideologies that were drawn from religious beliefs. And so that is a significant, has been the same really. The drivers are the same, but the changes in the composition of the actors, that is something different. And a number of the sessions here touched upon that. At the very top, organizationally, large organizations capable of large-scale operations, I call them proto-states. But at the same time we've seen the growth of terrorist organization, we've seen the atomization of terrorist violence, with the remote radicalization and recruiting of individuals around the world, single individuals via the internet. That radicalization, that recruiting process is taking place faster and faster, and sadly, it's involving younger and younger people. I mean, that simply is a reflection of the technology itself. And when you think of that, you really, as I do, you despair about the young kids with these devices. What are they exposed to? What is that going to do to them? How the hell do we deal with this? At the same time we see this remote recruiting, we also see self-selecting terrorists shopping for ideologies online as conveyors for their individual discontents and aggression. And indeed, within that category, there are some people, psychologically troubled individuals, for whom terrorism is an opportunity for personal performance. That is really terrorism as theater. The ideology is terrorism for the sake of terrorism. Recording violence with GoPro cameras, live stream violence, terrorism as a global competition for body count, as if it's some kind of a video game. These are mass murders with manifestos. I kill, therefore I am. We also see, beyond this, at sort of the very bottom, an increase in random social aggression. That is, acts of violence that are not driven by ideology or by traditional criminal motivations, but are simply expressions of violence. People being pushed off subway platforms into the path of oncoming planes, people who just go up to someone and hit them over the head with a hammer. Part of that, it may be the reflection of a post-pandemic society. You know, medieval historians talked about society in the way of in the wake of the Black Death, and they said that society was on edge, quick to violence. Can't blame it entirely on the pandemic, because in fact these trends preceded the pandemic, but they were accelerated by the pandemic. Societies are increasingly divided. We see this in Europe. We sadly see this in my own country. We see this here in Israel. Politically, culturally divided. Jonathan mentioned that I live in California. We have wildfires in California. What we know from the wildfires is that it is not the spark that determines the magnitude of the conflagration. It's the volume of dry tinder. And in many of our societies, these are filled with dry tinder, where any single incident may explode on the internet, through disinformation, through social media, and catch fire and really create a much greater incident. Another notion, and this came up in several sessions, is that the current events have reignited a debate about the definition of terrorism that we thought had been settled decades ago. This was a big battle in the 1970s. We needed a precise definition of terrorism in order to enlist international cooperation. And we ultimately were able to arrive at this idea that terrorism is defined not by the identity of the perpetrator, not by the nature of the cause, but by the quality of the act. You look at the individual act. And yet we're seeing again now that assertions that, we cannot label as terrorists those legitimately fighting against settler colonialism, which has no legitimate right of self-defense. And so that is another change. Now, at the same time, I say that we want to have an objective definition of terrorism, something that can be precise. We ourselves, those of us who spend our time looking at this phenomenon, really have to broaden our view a bit, as it was indicated here, that yes, there is terrorism, but that terrorism takes a variety of forms and in fact is one piece of a far more complex definition of warfare. Terrorism coexists with disinformation, influence operations, cognitive warfare. It coexists and overlaps with cyber warfare. And back to traditional modes, assassinations, murder for hire, economic warfare. Economic warfare waged through sanctions, or economic warfare carried out with drones into the Red Sea that interrupt shipping, that has a major effect on the global economy. We see terrorism campaigns waged by transnational criminal organizations. But the question arises, should we label drug cartels terrorism? Is that a useful thing? Is it a distraction? Does it dilute our approach to this? And we've heard about all of these at the conference. Now, what is interesting, however, is that these are addressed separately. And I think this was a point made here on the panel. We put these in separate silos, separate corridors, separate boxes. And they cannot be addressed separately. Just as on a battlefield, one has to bring together the infantry, the armored divisions, the artillery. Those are not separate domains. One has to learn how to orchestrate all of these measures. The terrorists will learn how. They're doing it right now. They're demonstrating. We have to learn how to do it. We have obstacles to doing that in that we are organized bureaucratically. These are separate functions. And we have to overcome that to address this, and it has to start here with those of us doing the research. I mentioned earlier that states, national governments, in some cases, have adopted the idea of warfare based upon the basic principles underlying terrorism. It's not that we've abolished terrorism, it has become normalized, and states adopting it in the sense that warfare is increasingly about manipulating perceptions. Now, I'm not saying that kinetic force is obsolete, but kinetic force is just one component of a much broader battle. You know, looking back, and at my age, you become reflective. I did anticipate that power crudely defined, as the capacity to kill, destroy, damage, disrupt, oblige us to divert vast resources to the protection against these attacks, that would descend into the hands of groups, gangs, individuals, fanatics whose grievances, real or imaginary, it would not always be possible to satisfy. I think I got that part right. What I did not predict, of course, was the extraordinary events that have taken place, the headlines of the 2000s held, the headlines of the last couple of years. That is extraordinary. Looking back, I have to say, had I been able to do so, I'm certain that I would have been dismissed as Cassandra was in ancient Greek mythology, or told by my employers at the Rand Corporation that I would be advised to seek employment in Hollywood. But the bottom line is, honestly, I have no idea what future headlines we may see, and that is exactly what we have to be prepared for now. And that is why we annually come together in this conference. So good luck with all of your research. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.